Hello, my friends. My name is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of the Jazz Piano Fundamentals series, which now has 2 books, as well as Playing Solo Jazz Piano, which is about to have its 2nd edition come out. So stay tuned for more info on that. But today I want to talk with you about something just kind of fundamental to jazz improvisation, which is the 2-5-1 progression. The 2-5-1 is the most common progression in jazz. And so if you can improvise over 2-5-1s, you're going to be a pretty long way towards improvising over really any kind of jazz progression. So I really recommend to jazz pianists really of all levels that they include 2-5-1 voicings and improvisation in their practice sessions. This is something that the most beginning jazz pianists should be working on, as well as the more advanced pianists. So let's start with some basics here. This is a 2-5-1 in C, D minor 7, G7, C major 7. There's lots of resources out on the internet if you need to know how we got here. But basically, a 2-5-1 includes chords based on the 2nd, 5th, and 1st degree of a major scale. And there are both major and minor 2-5-1s today. We're just going to be talking about major 2-5-1s. So, first thing to know, just from a theoretical perspective, is that you can improvise using scales that go with the 1 chord. So in this case, the 1 chord is C major 7. And one way to think about this that's really helped me is to think in terms of key center. When we have a 2-5-1, for that whole progression, we are in the key center of C, and therefore we want to improvise using chords that go with that key center. And I can think of kind of 3 scales. The first and maybe the most obvious one is the major scale. You guys know your C major scale, I'm sure. So the good news about the major scale is you can make a ton of melodies. The bad news is that not all of these notes sound super great with all of these chords. For instance, with the G7, and here I'll let you see exactly what I'm playing here. If I'm playing a G7 in the left hand and I play a C in the right hand, it really kind of needs to be resolved. Similarly, if I'm playing C major and I play an F in the right hand, it really needs to be resolved. So the good news is, if you're smart about it, you can make a ton of amazing melodies using that C major scale. By the way, I just really often get the question of what kind of, what I'm playing in the left hand when I do these examples, and the answer is shell voicings. And you can look up my video on shell voicings, or I'm sure there's a lot of other resources. I talk about them in Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. So if you're curious what I'm doing in my left hand, the answer is shell voicings. Okay, 2 other scales to think about. One is the C pentatonic scale, which is really a subset of the C scale, which removes the notes that are usually kind of the most quote-unquote offensive or, potentially demand resolution the most, which are F, which really sounds bad against a C, and B, which is the major 7th here, but there's something about that pentatonic scale that really just holds everything together. So the good news about this scale is there's less potential for conflict. The bad news is it doesn't really allow you to make as many melodies, and to a jazz musician, somebody improvising with just the pentatonic scale, honestly, sounds a little bit amateurish. So it's an okay place to get started, but I wouldn't stay there for too long. So here's how it sounds. And let me actually qualify something that I said. It's not that we don't use pentatonic scales in jazz. We actually use pentatonic scales a lot. But somebody only using pentatonic scales and using just this major pentatonic scale probably isn't going to get the best results. Now, there is one element that we often add to the pentatonic scale, which is we commonly add this note, and it's a little bit small, between the second and the third scale degree. And some people call this the major blues scale or the sweet scale. I think there's a couple of other names. And it's definitely used in jazz, but maybe it's even more common in like blues, country, R&B, smooth jazz. So again, we use the scale in jazz, but we usually combine it with some other things. So great. Now the other scale that goes with the key center of C major is the blues scale. And this scale has quite a lot of notes that conflict with all of the chords in the major 2-5-1, right? Just thinking about C major, we can see that, you know, the E flat, the F we already said, the F sharp, and then the B flat. Those are like really nasty sounding notes. So the key to using the blues scale is to not end on one of those notes. So what's left here is C and G. And this is an overstatement, but most jazz musicians improvising with the blues scale are going to end their phrases on either a C or on either the root or the fifth of the scale. So, okay, so that blues scale is really full of conflict, but conflict is not so different from color when we're talking about jazz and jazz-based music. So those are your scales, and that's a really good place to start. But if you're truly going to play a 2-5-1 in a jazz style, we need to distinguish between these three chords, right? Because on one hand, I did say, here, it's weird to talk without anybody being able to see me. I did say, on one hand, you can't see my gesticulations, these beautiful gesticulations. That on one hand, that we can think of this as all being in the key center of C. But it is also three different chords, right? So it's really flattening them to treat them all the same way. And I'll tell you a secret, that even when I'm improvising with these scales, as an experienced musician, I'm somewhat consciously, somewhat subconsciously emphasizing different notes of the scales depending on which chord we're on. And as you get into an intermediate level of improvisation, that is really important. So, what is the first thing to practice? I would say the answer is arpeggios. And when I say arpeggios here, I am not meaning, like the kind of arpeggios that you practice as a piano student. By arpeggios, I just mean skipping between notes of the chord. And in jazz, we very commonly use what I refer to as a 3-5-7-9 arpeggio. As you might be able to guess by the name, this arpeggio goes between the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th of the chord. Brilliant. You guys are like, he thinks we're idiots. So for D minor 7, we would use the 3rd F, the 5th A, the 7th C, and the 9th E. For those of you to whom the term 9th is unfamiliar, it's going to be the same as the 2nd scale degree. We just always use odd numbers in jazz because chords are stacked in thirds. So we stack it 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. All right. 3, 5, 7, 9 on G is B, D, F, A. And on C major 7, E, G, B, D. So it sounds like this. By the way, I'm being a neglectful teacher. We should always practice in even number phrases because that's just how music generally works. So you want to have 2 measures of the one chord at the end of your 2-5-1. So one more time with that in mind. So you might say, well, that's great, but that's hardly an improvisation. That's just an exercise. And you are right. So how are we going to move between this exercise and improvisation? I have a handful of different ways. And there will be a second video to this little series. And I'll tell you even more things. But for now, first thing I would do is use these hand positions, but mix up, rhythms, repeat some notes, mix up the order. You can omit some notes. So let me show you with the other camera view here. So instead of just going, right, I'm gonna go, and I changed octaves, but that's no big deal. It's still 3, 7, 5, 9. This is slightly advanced, but notice that I'm trying to connect between the chords rather than just totally leaping, but I'm trying to find some connections, which is actually why I brought the G7 up an octave. Because I can connect between the A of the D minor and the B of the G7. And then the D of the G7 becomes the D of the C major. So the 5th of the G7 becomes the 9th of the C major. So I'm just using the 4 notes of each chord, of each arpeggio, to improvise. The other thing to do is to mix in these arpeggios with scales. And there's a ton of ways you could do this. You could, for instance, play around with the arpeggios where I've said blue, and then go to scales in the red. Not bad, right? Or we could reverse. We can make the blue scales and the red arpeggio. Or we could do it just more freely. We could even try to connect by scale into some of these arpeggios. Now, some of you might be noticing I'm really demonstrating using just the C major scale, but it is possible to mix in the blues scales. Sometimes the blues scale doesn't mix super well with the arpeggio sounds. Like, it might feel a little weird. like the first part works, the second part works. Do they fit together? In my opinion, it's like a little iffy. So just use your judgment. I don't necessarily have like a dictum of what you need to do. So these are the ways that I would start improvising on a 2-5-1. On one hand, use scales, and giving you a list of scales that you can use. On the other hand, start with this 3-5-7-9 arpeggio. It's really colorful. It really sounds typical for jazz. And then practice mixing the two a little bit, either alternating or using scales to kind of connect between the arpeggios. So for this video in particular, if you enjoyed it, and this seems like a good level for you, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 1 is a really good resource for you. If this was a little on the easy side, but you like the approach, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2 definitely has some next steps for you. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you soon.